Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are delighted to be hosting Sarah Chayes, or Shays, you pick, but it has to rhyme with Hayes, this evening for her book on corruption in America. I can't really understand how lucky we got to be able to host this event the night before, right before the presidential debate. I feel like there's a lot of ripe territory there, and I'm sure our guest, Norm Stockwell, who will moderate tonight's conversation, will get to that. Sarah is an expert on corruption. I don't think through her daily life, but she was the special assistant on corruption to Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as an advisor to David McKiernan and Stanley McChrystal. She's been a reporter for National Public Radio from Paris, covering Europe and the Balkans. She's the author of multiple books and also has one in the works right now. Norm Stockwell is the publisher of the Progressive magazine. He has a long, storied career in radio and also in archaeology. I'm not sure how storied that career is, but if you get him in there, he'll talk to you about it. I want to take a minute just before we get started to thank Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation. Their support of the Wisconsin Book Festival has been absolutely incredible all throughout the pandemic and really for the last 7.5 years, as most of us know. But they have gone well out of their way to make sure that these free cultural events remain available to Madisonians and now welcoming people from all over the world. So I'm going to step aside here and let Norm and Sarah get right to it. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here. Thank you, Norm. I know Sarah also has some rain going on, so there may be a little bit of background noise, but we're doing our best. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody, especially those of you that are missing the debate in order to watch us. Although if you're quick, you can do both tonight. Hopefully we'll have some fireworks here for you as well, although perhaps not the rain hitting the ceiling at Sarah's house there. Sarah Chayes, I know you as an NPR reporter. I remember your work on the air, and then when you left radio reporting and went to work in Afghanistan, first rebuilding communities and then later starting a cooperative to manufacture body care products, soap and so on. And then I kind of lost track of you. But I understand from your bio that you worked as a consultant for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I guess looking at that whole course of your life, what brought you through that path from reporter to activist to consultant to now looking at corruption?
Corruption did. It's interesting. Someone made a documentary in the very first year of efforts in Afghanistan. It's called A House for Haji Baba. And it's a great piece of work. I mean, it just sort of records, the fact that it's a great piece of work has nothing to do with me, let's put it that way. Brian Knappenberger did a really excellent job. And when you look at that film, which was made in 2002, what's stunning is that so many of the issues that eventually crystallized into systemic corruption were already available. I mean, one of the chief scenes in the in the documentary is me grappling with the governor of the province over stone because I'm trying to rebuild a house of a village that had been destroyed in the American bombing. That was like the first project that we set out to do, is at least repair what, the American intervention had destroyed right in front of our eyes. And this was to benefit the citizens of the province, right? And the governor is basically forbidding me from buying stone because he wants me to build the houses out of cement because he owned the cement factory. And so it's, and so you get from there to essentially a career coming to a greater and greater understanding of the structure and organization of this phenomenon. And it is structured. I mean, It's not, some Marvel Comics, mastermind sitting in a locked vault somewhere, but it is structured, dynamic networks that are transnational, that interweave public officials, business magnates, out and out criminals, and violent actors of one kind or another. These networks are kind of anchored in a given country, be it in Kabul, in Dubai, in Lagos, in Washington, D.C., in Moscow, in Beijing, but they interweave, with their counterparts that are anchored in other countries. And we are really seeing the operations full blown in public view, the operations of the American version of that before our eyes today.
And the book is called On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. Sarah Chayes is our guest here for the hour. Thank you so much. You talk about weaving. And my next question was, I was going to say, you weave your own life experiences throughout this book, and it's a wonderful book, and it's very thick. It's 400 some odd pages, about the last inch of which are notes, which I always appreciate very much, all the background knowledge and what went into creating this book. But one of the things that you weave through this book also is myths and history. You talk about Aristotle, you talk about King Midas, you talk about Heracles and the Hydra. Let's start out with Midas and the story of Midas, which really sort of informs the whole conversation of this book.
Thank you so much, Norm. And I'd also like to take a second to thank all of you who are watching us tonight, because, you're beyond busy these days. And to take an hour out of your lives to spend it with us, talking about, I would say, current events through a different lens, we really appreciate it. And thank you, Norm, for, and the second thing I wanted to say is, it is too thick, that book. And so I did not mean to make it that long. I wrote it to be quite a read, and so I don't think you're going to find it ponderous. And do bear in mind what Norm just said, that a significant portion of that thickness is footnotes. And you don't have to read them. I mean, there's a lot, it's almost like a second book that's in the footnotes, but you don't have to read it. And so if you look at the thickness of the book without the footnotes, it's much more, digestible looking. So all of that said, thank you for beginning with the mythology, because it is not, it's not tangential to the book. It's really central. And I guess what I'd like to say is, we now use the word myth as an insult, right? It basically means something that's patently not true, and what an idiot, would actually believe that. Wrong. Myths are true. They're true in a really profound way, and our society has turned its back on these incredible storehouses of insight and wisdom about our condition as human beings. And as I look, sorry, I'm just going to adjust a little bit. There we go. As I look around at our public figures, I mean, they look like caricatures. I mean, it's like, are you kidding? Is this actually a human being? And I suddenly think, we've turned our backs on mythology, and so we're condemned to live it. The public figures striding our stages today could be plucked directly from the kind of monstrous or grotesque characters in mythologies around the world. Midas, he's the guy, remember, he did a favor to a god who offered him one wish. Immediately, Midas says, gold, gold. I want everything I touch to turn to gold. So the god is actually not too happy about that, but promised, and so fulfills the wish. And Midas, it takes him about 7.2 seconds to figure out what a gigantic blunder he's made. Because, he touches a twig. Oh, it turns to gold. Then he touches something. Oh, it turns to gold. Isn't this wonderful? Now he's hungry. It's lunchtime. He picks up an apple. Oops, can't eat it. His servant pours out some wine. Oops, can't drink it. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a kid's version of it, gives Midas a daughter. He adores this daughter. She sees his distress, comes running over, he kisses her forehead, and she turns to metal. The Midas disease is about pursuing wealth ahead of every other value. And in fact, it converts every other value into gold, metal, or today, zeros in bank accounts, right? So someone afflicted with the Midas disease, everything they touch, they're going to reduce it to zeros in bank accounts. That means the land, what's on the land, what's under the land, human creativity, human labor, everything, human relationships, everything of value. Imagine you put your society, in the charge of people afflicted with the Midas disease. What happens? That's the situation we have, right? The Midas disease is so pandemic in this country. Did you, when you were preparing for this, Norm, did you ask people what they think of when they hear the words the Midas touch, or have you ever?
No, but I know that it's the title of one of Donald Trump's books.
Yeah, that's true, but it's presented as a positive, right? Most people would love to have, quote, the Midas touch, meaning they've completely missed the entire moral of the story, which is that the Midas touch is a curse. So that's Midas.
Yeah.
Will you indulge me with one more, which is Jesus?
Yeah, I was gonna get there. It's on my list, but I wanted to, before we get there, I wanted to say, since we started out talking about archaeology in the introduction, you did look into the archaeology of the origin of the real King Midas. And the thing that is so interesting is that the King Midas develops at the same moment as money.
That's it. He was king in Phrygia. Thanks. That was the punchline. He was king in Phrygia, basically where and when money was invented. And money is a novel. It is a revolutionary means of storing value. And that takes us to another critical point of this myth, and that Aristotle gets into, is that, unless you're the pharaoh, right? Before money, there was a natural limit to how much wealth you could amass, because it was in stuff, right? You just didn't have, if it's in flocks of sheep and fig trees, you cannot have an infinite amount of it. And flocks of sheep and fig trees require care. You have to tend to them. You have to devote yourself to that kind of natural wealth. I'm not writing a diatribe against well-being or wealth. I'm writing a diatribe here against the disease which causes us to measure our social status in terms of how many zeros we have in our bank accounts. Because, as Aristotle pointed out, once you have money, that becomes a race with no finish line. The desire for more is infinite, because if the person you're competing against has, $3.2 billion, well, then you need to have $5 billion, and then you get ridiculous, extremes where you've got the current Secretary of Commerce who's lying to Forbes magazine about how many $1 billion he owns by like $2.5 billion. I mean, are you kidding me? You know, because they are afflicted with the Midas disease, and that's about money.
And so here we come now to this moment sort of halfway between where we are today and the beginning of the story where money is invented. And that halfway moment is where Jesus goes into the temple.
Right. And so there you have a society which is run by people afflicted by the Midas disease, right? You've got this little tight-knit group, cabal of, if you will, billionaires. I mean, they're the billionaires of the time who have figured out how to extort money from people when they have to make their yearly offering, religious offering, right? So what used to be a highly democratic ceremony of dividing, you know, the sacrifice equally among the community has become, you know, a way of extorting and excluding people from the community of the blessed, if you will. And that is the moment where Jesus, you know, strides up the stairs of this temple and starts throwing the furniture around. And I mean, so I look at archaeology again, and I could not believe it. I did not know that the Temple of Jerusalem was the most magnificent building east of Rome. I mean, the thing was, you know, it was gold-plated. I'm like, another gold-plated building like the Trump Tower, and it's the Temple of Jerusalem, really? And you've got the High Court, and you've got the bank, and you've got the money changers, basically basically you have Wall Street and Fort Knox, you've got Washington, D.C., you've got the Vatican because it's the religious center, and you've got a military base. So let's throw Qatar in there. That is what Jesus took on. And what's fascinating is, so number one, it's a pretty violent piece of work for the Lamb of God, right? He doesn't kill anyone, but it's pretty dramatic. That is the moment that the cabal of billionaires decides they have to kill him. It wasn't about love thy neighbor. It wasn't about turn the other cheek. It was once he brought together the cross-cutting community that he had put together with love thy neighbor and shows them who is stealing the collective well-being in a sacrilegious fashion, because it's right up in the place of the community's most sacred values that are being converted into money, right? Just what we had in Midas. That's the moment they decide to kill him. So it's a really dramatic climax, in fact, to the gospel, which I was surprised to discover, you know, was not particularly taught with much vim by a group of pastors that I raised it with. They say, oh yeah, we teach it once every 3 years in Lent. And I'm like, are you kidding? This is like, you know, this is what the story's all about.
And it's interesting, sort of in a parallel in our own modern history, was Martin Luther King's April 1967 speech at Riverside Church in New York, where he spoke out against militarism and extreme materialism.
Absolutely. And the March on Washington was about economic justice as well as racial justice. And in fact, Martin Luther, the original, is all about corruption too. So this does turn out to be a central driver in some of the most profound transformations in human history. And that's what lies ahead of us if we can grasp the opportunity.
So you start the book talking about money, and we can say money is the root of all evil. In this case, it's the root.
Love of money.
Yes.
Love of money.
It's the root of all corruption as well.
Absolutely.
And you talk about the thing that it replaced, which was this kind of I talk about it as gathering and sharing, but this sort of communal nature of pre-money societies.
Well, yes, although upon its introduction, money has this paradoxically democratizing effect. It's really, I had a real hard time grappling with that, because as it's initially introduced, it comes in with democracy in Athens, with an incredible flourishing of intellectual life and stuff like that. And similarly, in the 13th century and in the paper money in the American colonies. So it's quite interesting. Initially, it's democratizing. But then, once it gets captured by a cabal, then it simply creates a new aristocracy. But you're exactly right to talk about, in pre-money, or I would say in particular pre-agricultural societies, among hunter-gatherer societies, this is the giant revolution that Homo sapiens commits upon the primate order. The primate order is very hierarchical. Folks out there who are listening, this is a book about corruption in the United States, we promise. But some of these concepts are really important to get at what it is that afflicts us. And so what is so important to understand is that as a species, we inherit some primate hierarchical tendencies. That's just in our DNA. And that means that we have sort of proto-alphas among us, people who want to dominate, and also proto-everybody else. In other words, you have to have submissives in order to have dominance. And so that is built into our DNA. But what humans did, what Homo sapiens did, which no other primate did, was impose egalitarianism on ourselves. And we did it most probably when we decided to become meat eaters as a staple, because the game that we were hunting was huge. We couldn't hunt it by ourselves. And so we had hunting parties. We were a social animal anyway, and we were hunting in groups, and that meant that whoever brought down the animal that day really had to share, or he wouldn't get the help of his friends, of his bandmates the next time. And so it's a really interesting piece of, I would say, anthropology slash primatology that looks at this and went through ethnographies of, dozens and dozens of different hunter-gatherer tribes, and found that what they punish incest, they punish murder within the group, and they punish what you could call meat hogging. Anyone who steals more than his fair share of the meat, either by domineering behavior or by stealth, either way. And that is really severely punished, up to and including execution. And what I find so interesting in our increasingly hierarchical democracy is what a pass we're giving to our meat hogs. I mean, we've turned back into apes. We're begging for a handout, basically, but we are not reining them in. What's very interesting about this research is it shows, and this is what I was referring to a little bit in talking about Jesus, it shows very clearly that before successfully reining in a meat hog, the band would have to talk about it a lot together and reach a cross-cutting consensus. And it was only united that the band would be able to rein the guys in. If it was only a faction that wanted to discipline him, and it usually is a him in this case, although not always, then the band descends into factionalism, and that can get very dangerous. And there's internecine, fighting and this and that, and the band will often break up. And so key to reining in the dominator coalitions that are stealing way more than their share of our collective meat that we're all hunting together is that we join forces and bring them in together.
And that kind of gets us to the next area I wanted to touch on, also based in myth, and that's the myth of Heracles, as he was called by the Greeks, or Hercules, and the Hydra, which is the cover illustration on your book. And you talk about the Hydra as being an example of what these networks of corruption are. I just want to show you the cover from our magazine a couple of about 4 years, 5 years ago now,
Great.
was the octopus and the plutocrats, but this image of the multi-heads or multi-armed tentacles of this network of corruption. And one of the things that comes out of this Hercules myth is that he can't do it alone.
Right. So let me go back to the Hydra first. Given that this is a book about corruption, let's just pause for a second and talk about corruption. I'm not talking about your lone individual with the fingers in the cookie jar, and I'm not trying to downplay that. I'm not talking about individual venal self-dealing. When that exists as an aberration that can be effectively punished, you're in good shape. That's not what we're looking at here. What we're looking at is sophisticated and successful networks that intertwine, as I said, I think before, public, private, even criminal elements, and they switch places. Like I got to know Ahmed Wali Karzai pretty darn well. So Ahmed Wali Karzai was a construction magnate. He was the younger half-brother of President Karzai. He was the head of the provincial council, and he basically ran the opium trade in southern Afghanistan. So here was a guy who himself was a node in this network which intertwined all three of those, and he had some Taliban buddies. So if I had been killed, which I should have been, in downtown Kandahar, nobody would have raised an eyebrow. What was this American doing walking around, without a face covering in downtown Kandahar? And everyone would have put it down to the Taliban. If Ahmed Wali Karzai had called up one of his pals, the Taliban, and said, would you knock off this, this pain in the neck, no one would have been surprised. And that's how, with the exception of terrorist violence, our networks today include all of those elements, including out-and-out criminals, and including, you could call it formally, informal instruments of force. And that is armed people who don't have the right to wear a uniform. And they operate independently. So another point is we also have this expression, the revolving door. Again, as though one individual is pushing a door between government service and the private sector. Don't think about it that way. Think about that as the person that the network has placed, temporarily in public office. Her job there is to bend the instruments, bend the agency or the institution that she's in charge of to serve the purposes not of the public, but the purposes of the network. And that means changing the rules, changing the guidance, reallocating personnel, or if you can't actually weaponize this institution, gut it. Gut it. So in the EPA, when Pruitt was the administrator, he had this round-the-clock security detail, and everyone was laughing about it. Wow, he's such a scaredy cat. He thinks in Washington, D.C., he needs a round-the-clock security detail. Well, I found out that the people in that security detail were highly skilled criminal investigators, because the EPA is a law enforcement agency too, which goes after environmental crime. Well, you can't be chasing bad guys if you just pulled security for the boss and you have to spend all night, babysitting the boss. That's how you decapitate or decommission, in effect, hamstring an agency that you can't actively weaponize. The networks are transnational. And then this other hideous fact about the Hydra. You cut off one head and two more sprout. That is such a critical lesson to learn. I've seen too many anti-corruption uprisings around the world that focus so hard on the lone individual, that seems to personify it, that they don't realize you chop that head off, which is already a huge achievement. Topple the government of Guatemala, try it sometime, it wasn't easy. But what do you have? The Hydra sprouts another head. And I'm a little bit worried about that in this country, that there's such an overwhelming focus on the person of Donald Trump, that we are missing this hydra that's weaving its heads in and around, behind him, around him, and all of that. And frankly, that crosses the political divide. That's the other really frightful thing, is that I just scratched almost any name at random. I would scratch, and within 2 degrees of separation, I come up with someone in the opposite party. I mean, they are so interwoven at the top, these networks, while they are manipulating the identity divides to keep us from coming together in our cross-cutting egalitarian coalition.
And potentially then being able to address multiple heads of the Hydra at once, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But you've studied corruption on at least 4 continents now, I think, and but this book is really focused on the United States, and I want to go through some of that now. And you talk about the time when corruption really kind of excelled in our history, excelled in the sense of really dominated, which was the Gilded Age. And let's talk about that for a minute, but let's also talk about some of the movements that grew up to oppose it.
Yeah. So,
including our own here in Wisconsin with
right.
Fighting Bob La Follette.
Yes, exactly. And I couldn't touch on all of them, of course. And for me, this was I'm a historian by training, but, for me, the 19th century counts as journalism, like I was back a little bit earlier. And so it was a real education for me. And I was astonished at the degree to which the structure and operations were similar to today, meaning you had massive concentration of business, you had basically 3 revenue streams in the lead, and they were energy, finance, and high-end real estate. You had massive systemic fraud, so fraudulent stocks being sold for, fantastical projects that never really existed, including like an original Suez Canal and a Panama Canal, and there's a character that I stumbled upon who kind of personifies the whole thing, who's French actually, and she was a woman who had this gift of gab that she could just convince people of stuff. And she built this gigantic career where she had, 3 presidents of France and the justice minister and I don't know how many Congress people and the chief of police wrapped around her little finger on the basis of a so-called inheritance, which was a shifting story anyway, but she would point to this locked safe and say, oh, in there is all the paperwork and I'm going to come into this huge inheritance. And on the basis of that, she floated bonds, she, hawked, she pawned all this, she would get gifts of jewelry and then pawn them and this and that. She had 5 different mansions around the country, whatnot, when they finally arrested her and found a button and a newspaper in this safe. And it turns out that that is exactly the business model of the savings and loan crisis. I mean, it's almost identical.
And we should break for a second to note, in terms of the news of the moment, that Donald Trump's income taxes, again,
exactly.
This case of, I have all this money in the safe and it's not actually there. I happened to be looking at the Chicago Tribune from October 1931 yesterday, and the cover photo is Al Capone being arrested and put into prison for 11 years because he had defrauded on his taxes for $215,000. So, but anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, that's where I realized, the boasting about the billions is not just vanity. it's part of the business model. That's another way of saying I've got this inheritance in the safe. And it was also the interweaving of the networks. And so you've got, you put the railroad lawyer becomes the attorney general, and then, gets a bunch of injunctions passed against strikers who are, unions and non-union workers who are striking against the railroads. And so you essentially have the total interpenetration of business magnates with government officials, armed force, because you have the National Guard, which could come into play during the election. I mean, we could be looking at a very similar scenario here. That's why my hair's on fire a little bit, even though I'm kind of laughing. You did have, and you also had criminality, out and out criminality. Most of these guys a lot of these guys started out as criminals, and then they, like people like Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, and those guys were maybe not Carnegie, but a couple of the other ones were out and out criminals, who realized that systemic corruption is a much safer way to rob the country, and you had the most extraordinary ecosystem of protests. I mean, spending time in that world was a real inspiration. And I look at three broad currents on corruption in America, one of which is the kind of labor movements across a lot of the big cities. And don't forget, this is a period where not only do you have a racial divide, you've got a class divide within labor, because you've got the highly skilled, manufacturing, very fine manufacturing, and then you've got the new mega factories that are less skilled. You've got language divides like you can't imagine it. I mean, we think we're a country of immigrants today. We think immigration is it was amazing at the time, and yet these organizers, you hear about them, churning out their weekly newsletters in 7 different languages. Like, are you kidding me? Right. And organizers going around with translators and stuff like that. That's a labor movement. And a very important aspect of it is the 8-hour day. And the 8-hour day wasn't just about we don't want to work so hard. It was a very profound reflection on the human condition, that we need time to be human. We need to rest, we need to work, we need to take care of our chores, and we need leisure to be creative with. Unfortunately, a lot of our tech monopolies these days are crowding out our own creativity with their noise, so they're using up our leisure, and that's unfortunate, and that's a whole other topic. But the way they spoke about why they were promoting the 8-hour day was really profound. Note, I am speaking to you from a rainy West Virginia, where we're back to 12-hour shifts in all of our factories here. So it's pretty amazing how far back to the Gilded Age we are. The second, very closely overlapping with that, were some of the more creative political movements, which get a bad rap because they've got names not only as evil as socialism, but my goodness, anarchism. You read the anarchists, they don't believe in no structure. They believe in collective grassroots structures as a foundation for political and economic life. I spent a lot of time in France, where much of the rural economy is organized in co-ops. You buy your wine from the Cave Coopérative, the cooperative wine cellar, where all the vintners in the region put their grapes, the small ones who don't have their own ability to make the wine. That's how the economy is organized, and you get great French food that way, so it's not all bad, And then the third most unexpected to me was the Farmers Alliance, which is the movement growing out of the place that then as now, most cityots look down their noses at, right? Rurality, it was the West, which means West Texas and Missouri and up to Wisconsin. And these
Kansas.
Kansas, exactly. These were people, I mean, they lived on farmsteads, on homesteads, tossed in the prairies, and they were meeting every 2-3 times a week, driving their covered wagons to the schoolhouse. They were getting lessons from traveling lecturers in, the latest agricultural techniques and how to best, pile up your silage and whether or not to use chemical fertilizer and the monetary system and the gold standard and, national banking. I mean, these people came up with direct election of senators. They came up with flexible currency. They came up with, a lot of the reforms that were eventually enacted in the New Deal. What was shocking to me was that 70 years of this, I mean, of creative, persistent, courageous, determined protest basically got nowhere. Not that it wasn't worth doing, because all of the remedies got invented, but it was pretty chilling what it took to turn the Gilded Age around. And I don't know if that's probably a question.
Well, it is, although I wanted to note something you say in the book here, which I think is really important. You say the failure of each of these movements spelled the failure in the United States of a certain kind of participatory democracy. But you go on to say, even in failure, these movements profoundly altered the American system, at least for a time. Almost every demand made by labor and alliance movements, from the 8-hour day to flexible paper currency to direct elections, as you just said, was enacted. So, I think it's very much this kind of, one step forward, 2 steps back, that every time we do have popular movements arise to respond to this, we make some progress. Maybe we get knocked back in the backlash, and we could talk about that a little bit in terms of what's happened in the 1980s and 90s, as well as
well, but what I want to say is this. I mean, they did get enacted, but not when the movements were underway. I mean, not when at the height of the movements. What it took, and we'll get it took something to knock this country on its ear in order for the elites to then turn around and say, oh, golly gee, yeah, those guys back 30 years ago really had a good point. We'll get there. But yes, in other words, the popular movement is absolutely essential. And the more cross-cutting, the better. And so how cross-cutting these movements were is really important. One of the things I forgot to mention that they stood for was equal pay for equal work across genders. One of the really effective things that the corrupt networks of the day did to break the movement, apart from brute force, was to play on the identity divide. And that's primarily the race divide. That is what really had the most devastating effect.
Right, and we had a big backlash against immigrants then, as we do now.
Yeah.
We're going to have to start taking questions from the audience in a minute,
great.
but
that's not a sad thing. That's a happy thing.
Right. No, but I don't want to lose the thread of what you just brought up, which is what happened to the Gilded Age, and you sort of mark the end of the Gilded Age with the election of Franklin Roosevelt. And I think about Roosevelt, his Common Man speech, and later his Economic Bill of Rights in 1944. But it was really, as you tell it in the book, the world wars and the pandemic, which really sort of pushed people together to respond in a way that created that change.
That is what is the terrifying lesson for me out of all of that historical research, is what it took. I mean, we all now have experienced sort of the disaster solidarity ethos, right? We're feeling it to some extent now. How many of us have sewn a mask, that we wouldn't have sewn before, or have got groceries for a neighbor, or what have you. But this has been the least conducive, the disaster least conducive to disaster solidarity that you can imagine, because we have to all be apart. Look at us. Normally we should be across the street there in the actual building speaking to each other face to face. Disaster solidarity is a phenomenon that everyone knows about. You know, you have a flood, everyone helps everyone. You have a fire, it doesn't matter what race you are. No one asks your political affiliation before they save you off the roof of your house, you know, in a flood, right? So just think about those disasters. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, that's 2 world wars, 2 genocides, nuclear bomb, a pandemic that makes this one look like, honestly, a case of the flu, and a global economic meltdown. That's what it took to generate enough disaster solidarity to really make, not that they all came. I mean, Roosevelt had a devil of a time getting the New Deal through, you know? The strikes continued throughout the 30s and even the 40s. I mean, to get decent working conditions and an 8-hour day. All it meant, and then we had to fight again for the beginning of civil rights, and then environmental rights and gender rights. You know, I mean, the fights continued throughout those decades, but at least they had a hope of winning. Whereas for the 70 years previously, from 1870 until 1935 or 40, they did not. They just didn't make any headway. And so that's what it took. And why I am frightened is, what is the 21st century version of that bad a series of calamities? I mean, we're really staring something horrific in the face. And so the urgency here is to ignite that solidarity now, to fight these meat hogs in order to stave off the disaster. That's what I'm calling for.
And we're speaking with Sarah Chayes. The book is On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. And we've been really just touching the surface of all of the ideas and thoughts and history and content that is in this book. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have some questions from the audience. Lest you think that this book only goes up to 1935, it does go up to the present day, the very present moment. And a quote here about Donald Trump from the book: Donald Trump is at once a symptom of America's increasingly corrupt system and an exaggeration of it so extreme as to seem like a grotesque aberration. And one of our questions from the audience is, in 2016, there were so many people who were disaffected with our economic and political system, with seeing this kind of corruption at play, that they just wanted to blow it all up. And they did that by voting for Donald Trump.
I agree with that 100%, and not to plug my previous book, but it's called Thieves of State: Why Corruption Threatens Global Security. And it's all about countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan and whatnot. And there's an epilogue in which I say, hey guys, you know, this ain't just the WOGs. That came out in 2015. It ain't just the WOGs. And you know, and I felt like we are on this spectrum. And then lo and behold, 2016 happens, you know, basically 2 years later, just less than 2 years later. And I'm like, okay, that is a demonstration of exactly the thesis that I was outlining in that book. It happened to us way faster than I thought it was. It was kind of extreme voting rather than joining an actual extremist insurgency, which is what I was looking at in Afghanistan or those other countries. And I think I see a second half of that question about whether basically the Democrats are prepared for all-out war. It's a slightly different question. I'd like to pause for a second and just make clear my point politically, which is, this is not just Donald Trump. As that question brings out, it was the vote for Donald Trump that reflected how systemically corrupt the United States already was. Ironically, when people vote for a wrecking ball, they're not choosing the better among two, it's not, they're not doing comparative political analysis here. They're voting to blow something up. Sometimes that means voting for something that's even more corrupt than what they were reacting against. And that's kind of what happened to us. And I do think that he is a grotesque exaggeration of this phenomenon and a danger to our republic. No question about it. That being said, nobody should fool him or herself that a Biden-Harris administration will automatically address the problems of systemic corruption. In fact, if left alone, it will leave them precisely in place because those two are very much part of the pre-Trump version of that system. And the sort of influence peddling business model that's come to dominate Washington. And so it will very much be in our hands as citizens to hold them to, should they get into office, to hold them to a reform agenda. Now, I urge you all to read an article in The American Interest called From November to January, or Getting from November to January. It's about a war game that was played on our election, where people who are used to doing exercises like this, were split into teams arbitrarily, Democratic team and Republican team. It is absolutely chilling what they came up with in terms of how different scenarios would work their way out. And one of the chilling elements is that one side was playing to win, and that was the Republicans, and the Democrats were kind of trusting, quote, institutions to, quote, work. And that is not going to be sufficient. I think that we are in for a rough ride, and we should all be ready. It's not just the lawyers, it's the rest, it's everybody to defend the democracy of this country.
And one of the questions asks about the Republican Party as a criminal organization. And I think you've made the point very clearly that these two parties, especially at the upper levels, are incredibly intertwined and part of much of the same hydra. But it's worth pointing out that it is Republican legislatures and Republican activists that have moved to gerrymander our electoral districts and push some of the voter ID laws. And you talk in the book about the Koch brothers, you talk about the Powell memo from 1972, and these steps that have been undertaken over the past, going on 48 years now, to secure these positions of power for the networks of the powerful, which are more and more dominated by Republican activists.
I would put it this way, that there definitely has been a deliberate and carefully planned and executed, I want to say executed with iterations and executed with, rivalries and turbulence and mistakes and all that kind of thing, plan to bend the institutions of this country into the service of kleptocratic networks, and that has been led almost exclusively by Republicans. That does not mean that all Republicans are part of the plan, but it does mean that the main planners and executors of this thing, the main ones have been Republicans. I would say that in the top of the banking sector, you've got a lot of Democrats who have been very instrumental also. And in some Chamber of Commerce big businesses, there are probably some Democrats. So let's be careful there. The role that leading Democrats have played is different, but I think in some ways equally damaging. And that is the role of validators. So you have the Reagan Revolution, right? You have this big apparent political clash between Republicans and the Clinton Democrats, right? Up to and including impeachment that makes it look like there's this gigantic, philosophical division between the two. You look at Clinton administration behavior and it validated the Reagan Revolution. It turned it into bipartisan orthodoxy. And that's the danger of it. They're not in the lead, the leading Democrats who are part of this thing. They're not running this thing. They are reaping less money. They're being bought off cheaper, if you will, but they nonetheless are turning it into the kind of bipartisan orthodoxy that makes half of the electorate in this country say it's not worth voting. And so it's true the Republicans are in the lead, but, at some point you have to say, then what you're dealing with is intra-network rivalry rather than any fundamentally, I want to say, substantive difference on these issues between the parties.
And we only have a little over 3 minutes left, and I want to just close up quickly with the last question that we can get to today, which is someone asks the question, you've studied corruption on multiple continents. Are there facets of corruption that are uniquely American?
It's a great question, and I must say that offhand, I don't see any. Or at least what I would emphasize is that I've been more blown away by how perfectly we fit the model that I developed looking at countries like Nigeria and Honduras than the opposite, than that I was struck by any remarkable differences. And that is food for thought.
And a lot more food for thought in the book on corruption in America and what is at stake. A very, very important book at this moment in time.
Thank you. And stuff to do. Believe me, this is not just admiring the problem.
Right. We didn't even get to the epilogue, which I was going to touch on, and I'll just really quick say it reminded me very much of Charlie Chaplin's speech at the end of the movie The Great Dictator, which, if you haven't watched that recently, is definitely worth giving a listen to, because it's very, very appropriate for our times and for this book. Sarah Chayes, thank you so much for joining us for this event tonight. And thank you, Connor, and the Book Festival.
Thank you all, and thanks for tuning in, folks.
Well, thank you, Norm. Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate the conversation tonight. The book is On Corruption in America. There's a purchase link at the bottom of your screen, and we do encourage you, if you can, to buy the book from our local independent bookstore at Room One Zone. That helps us keep authors like Sarah coming to the Wisconsin Book Festival. We thank you so much, and we will see you on Thursday night for former U.S. Representative Katie Hill, or even Friday night for Pulitzer Prize-winning author Marilyn Robinson. Thank you so much. We're delighted to have you. Have a good night.